All right, we're good to go, Eric.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for our second module in this year's module series on nitrogen management. For those of you who were here last week, our module was focused mostly on nitrogen management from a manure perspective. Today, we'd like to build on that and move into discussions on fertilizer as well. A couple of background slides and just catching up slides in case some of you were not able to make it to our webinar last week. The 4R principles of nutrient stewardship are a fairly simple concept that have been around for a number of years. And it's looking at trying to get the right source of nutrients applied at the right rate with the right time and the right place also in mind. And we feel that if people are able to apply their nutrients using a 4R framework, that there's an economic, an environmental, and a socially sustainable outcome that can come from the use of 4R frameworks. So as we move forward through this, I do want to stop and pause for a minute and just thank our sponsor for these webinar series, the Campbell Foundation, for their support in nutrient stewardship and for their support of Pennsylvania 4R Alliance. This was a screen or a shot that we had up last week talking about the different pathways that nitrogen can leave our field once we apply it. And really, once you're talking about manure or once you're talking about fertilizer, these loss pathways apply equally to both sources. So fertilizer nitrogen can go through these loss pathways in the exact same way that manure nitrogen can. So I think it's important for us to understand that when we think of a holistic approach to nutrient management, where we're using the avoid, control, and trap strategies to reduce agriculture's input on surface water, we do need to keep in mind that manure and fertilizer losses are equal. We have the same potential for our fertilizer loss as we do the manure loss. And those losses can occur in the exact same pathways. We can have denitrification and volatilization, we can have immobilization, we can have runoff and erosion. You know, the goal of any application, whether you're talking about putting a couple of tons of chicken manure on, or whether you're talking about putting 200 pounds of urea on a cornfield, is to get as much of that nutrient into the plant as we possibly can. And we want to make sure that you as advisors have the tools that you can take to the farmer to have an advanced discussion on making sure that we have enough best management practices in place, both in the field and on the edge of the field, to facilitate that plant uptake and maximize crop yield, maximize nutrient use efficiency, all that fun stuff. So a refresher on some of our loss pathways. Volatilization. We worry about volatilization losses when we have surface applications of both manure and fertilizer. Those of you who are involved in the state's nutrient management program know full well the magnitude of volatilization that can occur from some of our surface applied manures. We also worry about volatilization when we're applying our nitrogen sources in advance of crop needs. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's an important concept to understand. From a denitrification perspective, we really worry about nitrogen loss from that denitrification process whenever we have water-filled pore spaces exceeding 60%. Some of the conversations we had last week on denitrification were, take a look at concentrated flow areas within a field, take a look at poorly drained soils. Those are the areas where you're going to see denitrification losses first. We definitely worry about erosion and runoff when we have low infiltration rates in soils, particularly on dairy farms. We do a lot of work on dairy farms, and soil compaction from silage harvest, from manure application is a serious concern for us from a root growth perspective, but also from an infiltration perspective. If we have compacted soils and we have low infiltration rates, we can't get nitrogen, we can't get phosphorus down into the soil. It has a higher tendency to run off. So we worry about erosion and runoff losses when we have these low infiltration rates, when we're making these surface applications of manure and fertilizer, and really when we have conservation plans that are not implemented for the appropriate rainfall intensity. And when I think of the rainfall intensity, personally, I think of soybean stubble fields where we just notice a lot more gullies and ditches as time goes by, and perhaps we just don't have the appropriate conservation plans in place for the intensity of rainfall that we're seeing on those fields. Next loss pathway that I would want to remind you about, and my computer is not cooperating, so we'll just hold off for a second. We have leaching and immobilization losses here that we also want to touch on, and that we did touch on in last week's presentation. Immobilization losses in particular are something that I would want you to think about as we move towards encouraging farmers to adopt more soil health practices. We want them to adopt no-till. We want them to adopt cover crop. We want them to do what they can to improve the soil health, to improve the carbon sequestration in their soil, and hopefully improve the soil structure. Some of the downside of that is when we have a lot of crop residues, when we have a lot of cover crop and massive amounts of biomass that our cover crops are producing, is that immobilization can become an issue where when you apply nitrogen fertilizer, particularly in a surface broadcast application, that fertilizer gets tied up by the residue, by the biomass, and is unavailable for crop production. So that is a concern for us in our soil health systems that we certainly want to convey to you and have you be aware of when you're talking to your customers and farmers about some of the best management practices that we really need in place to address our erosion and runoff concerns or our leaching concerns. So I'm still having a little bit of difficulty with my computer here. I'm going to move on to leaching a little bit. I worry about leaching in situations where we have a lot of manure, particularly in corn silage acres. When you think of leaching and the issues associated with leaching, I would want you to think about that bare ground acre after corn silage harvest and the amount of nitrogen that can build up in that soil through the course of the year through mineralization rates, and what kind of practices we need in place to prevent that leaching from becoming an issue. So I'm going to see if I can escape out of my presentation and then come back into it here, and then we can continue. So leaching, we worry about leaching, we worry about immobilization. You're all experts on that now. We can move on. A quick poll for you. And just like last week, we had some polls built into our presentation that was helpful for us to kind of facilitate conversation and look ahead and plan. So I'd like to know from you what loss pathway you feel is most important or most concerning to you when you think of manure applications. So I'll let that go for a second or two, and then we'll close the poll and we'll talk about that. So I think it's important to understand that all of these loss pathways can be an issue with manure. But as we move forward with the type of conservation practices that we want to see on farms, where we see more no-till, we see more cover cropping, the majority of our manures are surface applied right now. They're not injected, they're not incorporated within 24 hours, meaning that volatilization is really the main concern that we have for manure applications. And from these questions, 21% of you had chose leaching, 60% of you had chose volatilization, 3% denitrification, and 32% erosion and runoff. I really feel like depending on the unique circumstance of when you're applying manure, each of these losses could be the biggest concern that you have. But in general, when we're talking about manure applications across the state or across the region, volatilization losses of nitrogen are really the biggest issue that we have. So moving on to the next slide. Our presentation last week really focused a lot on the use of mass balance calculations. And just to refresh your memory on mass balance calculations, they're really the industry standard for both conservation professionals that are writing nutrient management plans, as well as certified crop advisor working at the local ag retailer. And it's that simple logical calculation that takes into consideration all of the different contributions you can have to nitrogen in your field, whether it's the past legume contributions from last year's soybean crop or alfalfa crop, whether it's the manure applications that you've made over the past 3 to 5 years and how that manure application continues to mineralize as time goes by, or how the manure that you're putting on this year can be calculated and contributions can be given from that. I think the important thing here is that these mass balance calculations have been used for so long, they truly are trusted by farmers when it comes to making those nitrogen management decisions. The mass balance calculations are definitely on the avoid part of the spectrum when we think of our avoid control trap strategies. If we don't apply it, or if we can apply it more efficiently, we don't need to control it, we don't need to trap it. So we're certainly looking at avoiding over application through the use of our mass balance calculations. We have the AC38 mass balance calculation up here. It's a good mass balance calculation. It does take into consideration some of our nitrogen loss pathways. But I would also want to reiterate to you that that mass balance calculation, for as comprehensive as it can be, it's really the starting point for implementation conversations. Once you go through the exercise of figuring out the farm's environmental liabilities through some of these mass balance factors, now you can start talking about how we're going to implement that plan and how we're going to move towards using our fertilizer nutrients in a more efficient manner. So within that mass balance calculation, you have those soil nitrogen pools, those pools of nitrogen that are coming from our legume credits, that are coming from our manure history credits. And a lot of that contribution is unknown. We don't necessarily know exactly how much nitrogen a soybean plant is going to contribute. We don't exactly know how past manure applications are going to mineralize. It's an extremely complex process that microbes and other living things in the soil go through to convert that nitrogen from an unavailable form to a plant available form. And within these mass balance calculations, we really try to simplify that complexity so that we're in the ballpark when it comes down to quantifying that contribution. But it is an extremely complex process. And in terms of our opportunity to manage nitrogen on a more advanced level, this is where our opportunity exists. If we can find ways to take all the soil health practices that we're implementing in a field and try to quantify that practice's ability to cycle nitrogen or produce nitrogen, that's really going to help the farmer dial down his fertilizer applications and make sure that we're not over applying nitrogen fertilizer for the scenario that the farmer has. So in our AC38 mass balance template, it's doing a great job of taking into consideration our manure history. It's doing a great job of taking in our legume history. Last week, we talked about how those numbers, the 35 pounds or the 50 pounds, that also reflects the inherent losses that occur from soybean residual. If you harvest your soybeans in October and we're planning for next May, between October and May, you're experiencing nitrogen loss from that soybean residual, and that 50 pounds that is in this example has those losses baked in. We're understanding that there are losses associated with these soil nitrogen pools. What it would be great for mass balance calculations to be able to include would be some more site-specific information on soil organic matter and how cover crops can be used to either help increase the cycling of nitrogen or increase the production of nitrogen within our system. Manure nitrogen. There's a lot of things that we can do to increase the retention of manure nitrogen, and it really depends on the management choices that farmers make. And that is clearly laid out within our AC38 calculations, where we talk about how soon manure is going to be incorporated, if we have the organic fraction, if we have the ammonia fraction, how the nitrogen availability of that manure source is going to come to our crop. So that is, the AC38 template does a great job of helping us figure that stuff out. Our tools for retaining manure nitrogen, because we definitely want to make sure we're having conversations with our farms on how we can maximize the amount of nitrogen that we retain from our manure applications. They're paying for this manure to be applied. They're paying for nitrogen fertilizer. If we can find ways to help improve the amount of nitrogen retained from our manure applications, it's less money they have to spend on fertilizer. So cover cropping. I don't think we need to go into a whole lot of detail on how cover cropping can help improve nitrogen retention from manure. We talked a lot about that last week in how applying a cover crop on the landscape when you're going to plan for late fall and winter manure applications can really help improve the retention of that manure that you apply. Tillage, low disturbance manure injection, nitrogen stabilizers, all tools that we want to be advocating for farmers to look at how to improve the nitrogen retention from their manures. Last week, we talked about tillage a little bit, and I'm going to reiterate some of my thoughts on tillage, that if a farmer is using tillage to improve nitrogen retention from manure, we need to make sure that, number one, we're in compliance with our soil conservation plan, and number two, that he's not spending more money on tillage than he's saving on the nitrogen fertilizer. That second example is usually the case for the clients that I deal with, that when we do the calculation to figure out how much nitrogen they're going to save by doing tillage, they're typically spending more on the tillage, and the tillage doesn't make sense. There could be other reasons why they want to do tillage, but tillage simply for nitrogen retention, you can do that calculation with your customers and you can give them information on how tillage can be a useful tool or a not useful tool for nitrogen retention. Supplemental fertilizer. We go through this whole calculation of really documenting how much nitrogen contributions we're going to get from our soybeans or from our alfalfa, how much nitrogen we think we're going to get from our past manure applications, how this year's manure plays into it. And then we get down to the bottom here and it says we need 92 pounds of supplemental fertilizer. And that's great. We've gotten to the point where we can narrow down the farmer's needs and say, we think you need somewhere around 90 pounds. Depending on the year, maybe it's 85, maybe it's 100. There's a lot of environmental factors that play into it, but 90 pounds gets you in the ballpark. What it doesn't tell you is what source of fertilizer is going to be best for that farm, what rate of fertilizer. It tells you the rate of supplemental nitrogen, but it doesn't convert that into a fertilizer rate for you. That's your job to do. It also doesn't tell you when the best timing for that application is going to be or the best placement for that fertilizer. The other thing I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address is that 92 pounds is susceptible to all the loss pathways. You can apply that 92 pounds on May 1st and it'll volatilize by May 5th. You can put it on your fields May 1st and it could start leaching on May 3rd. All the loss pathways that are associated with manure also can be associated with fertilizer. I think the other thing that these mass balance calculations are a little bit weak on is when it says 92 pounds of supplemental fertilizer is needed to achieve your yield goal, it's assuming that's 100% available. It's assuming that if you apply 92 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer to the field, that 92 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer is going to be taken into the plant. I think we can all agree it's probably not true. I've read articles, I'm sure you've read articles, that the use rates of our fertilizers are nowhere close to 100%. But there are tools that we can help our farmers and our customers implement that improve that efficiency. And that's kind of where I want to go next. When you're thinking of manure for our relationships versus fertilizer for our relationships, they're very different. I think that a manure for our relationship is almost a linear relationship. A farm will have limited manure sources present on the farm or available within the community. Their rates are going to be guided by their manure management plan or their nutrient management plan, which is going to look at their environmental risks and their considerations. The timing of that manure application, they're pretty limited. When the field is open, the crop growth stage, you don't have a whole lot of options for when manure can be applied. And certainly place, a very linear relationship from place. We're taking our manure out of our storages, we're applying it to our fields most of the time in a broadcast surface application. So we're limited on our ability to modify source rate, time, and place with manure. Fertilizer is not like that. When we think of source rate, time, and place for fertilizer, everything is interconnected. If I want to make a choice on a fertilizer rate, I need to be able to factor in what the timing of that application is going to be, what source of fertilizer the farmer is going to have access to, and what the placement of that fertilizer is also going to be. And it's a cyclical process where you may have an idea going into it, and where you're meeting with the farmer pre-season and you say, okay, you need 92 pounds of nitrogen. Here's how we're going to do it. And it's a process of asking questions where when it's almost akin to a nutrient management plan or a soil conservation plan. When you go to do the initial site visit, you probably have a list of questions that you're going to ask the farmer. How many animals do you have? What kind of bedding do you have? What kind of manure storage do you have? And I think the same holds true when we're working with fertilizer applications. You want to ask the farmers a certain number of questions in order to get a better handle on how they handle the fertilizer applications. What options are available from the farm's ag retailer? What other plant needs have we identified through soil testing or through plant analysis? How will the crop rotation affect our ability and our application windows? And what on-farm equipment is available for that fertilizer application? Those questions factor in very heavily into determining what your eventual rate of fertilizer is going to be. So I want to go through some of that with you. Quick poll. This is a fun one. So when does corn have its highest demand for nitrogen? Oh my gosh, I almost gave it away. Gotta go back. Here we go. We're gonna poll number 3. When does corn have its highest demand for nitrogen? Does it have it between that germination and emergence process before the corn gets about 3 inches tall? Does it have it between emergence and knee-high, or knee-high through tassel, tassel through grain fill, or is it really just equal distribution? The corn needs nitrogen at the same rate from the moment it germinates to physiological maturity. When do we have that highest demand for nitrogen? So you guys are answering the question. I'm going to close the polling here in about another 5 or 10 seconds. I think this question is really critical for us when we're working with farmers to try to manage their nitrogen in the best way possible. Understanding this question is really the foundation of how we're going to manage. So I'm going to end the polling here. And 3% of you chose germination to emergence. 28% of you chose emergence to knee-high. 57% of you chose knee-high to tassel. 16% said tassel through grain fill. Knee-high through tassel is the correct answer. And I've got a slide that really illustrates that for you in a very visual way. So if you haven't seen this slide before, and let me see if my computer will let me advance. If not, I'm going to jump out and jump back in. If you haven't seen this slide before, this comes from University of Illinois. Down at the bottom right, crophysiology.cropsci.illinois.edu. Great website to go to. It'll show you visual uptake of all the nutrients that a crop will need. So right there's 18 essential nutrients. The uptake patterns will vary a little bit differently for each nutrient, but it is interesting to see that they have a lot of similarities. So this is the nitrogen uptake for corn. The potassium uptake for corn is exactly the same. From planting up until about knee-high, we don't need a whole lot of nitrogen. If you go from VE to V6, so V6, think roughly knee-high, we need 25 to 30 pounds of nitrogen to get our corn out of the ground and get it to knee-high. Then from that V6 up until tassel stage, so from knee-high until when the tassels come out, we have just an exponential demand for nitrogen as time goes by, to the tune of, it could be 7-8 pounds per acre per day that a corn crop needs through that period. Then going from tasseling through kernel fill, the need for nitrogen tails off. But one thing I would like to point out to you, if you look over on the right, it says percent of the total uptake by the plant. And then you can go to VT, which is tassel, and you go up to where VT meets 75%. And what I would want you to understand is that at tassel, when that corn is tasseling, almost 25% of the total nitrogen uptake required to meet our yield goals hasn't happened yet. So when I'm out scouting fields, I never see nitrogen deficiencies when the corn is 12 inches tall, 18 inches tall, unless there's some egregious fundamental thing wrong. I hardly ever see nitrogen deficiencies during that rapid uptake phase between knee-high and tassel, because farmers generally do a very good job of managing nitrogen early on. Almost all the nitrogen deficiencies that I see in the field when I'm out scouting occur after tassel. And part of it is because after tassel, we still have 25% of our total nitrogen to go into the plant. So when I'm thinking of a nitrogen fertilization plan for a farmer, I keep that in mind. I want to make sure that whatever kind of plan we have in place for that fertilizer, that we're doing what we need to make sure that we have adequate nitrogen in the plant at tassel, but yet there's still enough adequate nitrogen available in the soil to carry us through the kernel fill period. So focusing on the right source of fertilizer. It's definitely important to make sure that we have the right fertilizer components, the right fertilizer products on the farm. What I would want you to understand is that not all nitrogen sources are the same. Here in the East, we have probably 3 main nitrogen sources, those being urea, ammonium nitrate solutions, and ammonium sulfate. So urea, dry fertilizer, it's 46% nitrogen, highly susceptible to volatilization. If you surface apply your urea, it has a high propensity to volatilize if it doesn't have soil contact with water in a very short time. It can almost be as much as, for each day that urea sits on the soil surface, after the day you apply it, it can lose 3% of its available nitrogen each day until it has enough water to be incorporated into the soil. Ammonium sulfate, another dry product, doesn't volatilize at all. Ammonium sulfate is extremely stable from a volatilization perspective. Why don't we use more ammonium sulfate? Because it's only 21% nitrogen. We need twice as much of it in order to meet our nitrogen goals. It's more expensive per unit of nitrogen than urea is, and it's the most acidic fertilizer that we use. It's a wonderful sulfur source. But when we apply a lot of ammonium sulfate, it tends to drive our pHs down a lot quicker than some of the other nitrogen sources that we can use. So those are the 2 most prevalent dry nitrogen sources that we have in our area. Urea ammonium nitrate, or the UAN liquid nitrogen solutions, are really common. Most of the customers that we work with are using a UAN solution. It has urea, it has ammonium, it has nitrate all in. About 50% of the total nitrogen in a UAN solution is urea, so it's highly susceptible to those volatilization losses. About 25% of it is ammonium, and about 25% of it is nitrate. So nitrate, more susceptible to leaching losses. So we want to make sure that we're working with the farmers to get that right nitrogen source on the farm. There's also a rate, time, and place component to choosing the right source. Like we talked about with ammonium sulfate, it might not be possible, or it might not be feasible or practical for a farmer to go out and apply 500 pounds of ammonium sulfate to a field when 200 pounds of urea or 30 gallons of liquid nitrogen would do the job. There's a volume component to how people make decisions. Same way with timing. Depending on the source that we're using and when we're applying it, do we need a nitrogen stabilizer for above ground or below ground protection? If we're surface applying our ureas, if we're surface applying our UAN solutions, there's a high propensity for volatilization. What are we going to do about that? So we want to make sure that we're addressing some of that too. And the placement of our fertilizer matters too. Banding versus broadcast. It's just like the conversation you would have about manure. If you're injecting dairy manure versus surface applying dairy manure, it's a lot of benefits that you have from that injection process. Let's talk about that with our farmers and make sure that they're aware of that banding versus broadcast synergy that can happen with our fertilizer as well. So I want to go through a case study with you, and this is a farm that I've been doing scouting on for over 20 years in Berks County, and I want to kind of walk through how we're making fertilizer decisions on this farm. It's a CAFO operation, has an Act 38 nutrient management plan. We're doing our soil testing every other year. We're taking manure samples annually. here's the soil test from the farm. A lot of things in here are going to make sense to you because you've seen them forever, and maybe some of the things you won't. From a nutrient management plan perspective, soil pH, soil phosphorus, soil potassium, all things that you would see in a mass balance calculation, a manure management plan, you name it. Some of the other things are different. You probably don't really look at sulfur concentrations or boron concentrations or zinc when you're doing a nutrient management plan. But we definitely want to look at it, because if we're missing the boat on sulfur, or if we're missing the boat on boron because our soils are deficient, we're never going to meet our nitrogen management goals when we have deficient soils of some other nutrient. All the nutrients are related. And if we have 18 essential nutrients, there's a relationship between nitrogen and sulfur. There's a relationship between phosphorus and zinc. And we want to make sure that that relationship is met so that the plant can utilize nitrogen or utilize phosphorus at the highest rate possible. So with his soil test, he's got potassium level of 121. In his forage-based rotation, that's low. His magnesium levels at 107, you might look at that and say, it says medium. And honestly, that's how I would look at it too. It says medium, it could be okay, it might not be okay. And then on the micronutrient side of things, we have sulfur, we have boron, we have zinc. Through time, Ed has applied a lot of sulfur fertilizer because we have identified sulfur deficiencies. And over the past couple of years, we're identifying boron deficiencies. So that's his soil test. It's probably the fundamental tool that we're using to evaluate fertilizer needs, both from a nitrogen standpoint and other. This is his plant sample. So we'll go into cornfields when the corn is about 12 to 15 inches tall. We'll take a plant sample, send it out to the lab. Here are the results. And you can see that potassium is low, right? So that corresponds back to 121 parts per million in his soil test. Being low for a forage-based rotation, we can confirm that through the plant analysis. The magnesium levels, we can certainly confirm that the 107 parts per million in the soil test is not enough for the uptake potential of his crop. And you can look at boron and see that the boron is so far sufficient for the uptake that we've had to date, but in the soil it's low. So those are nutrients that, in addition to nitrogen, when we're putting together that nitrogen program for him, we want to make sure that we're addressing the magnesium levels. We want to make sure we're addressing the boron levels, because all those things are related in terms of our overall holistic ability to manage nitrogen loss, to manage nitrogen uptake on his farm. So here's his nutrient management plan. Just focus on the column on the right. We've got a small grain silage, corn silage rotation. After the small grain silage comes off, he's putting 4,000 gallons of hog manure on, surface applied. And after that manure is applied, and after we take into consideration our double crop contributions, our manure contributions, we still need 120 pounds of commercial fertilizer. We still need 82 pounds of commercial potassium. So from a nutrient management perspective, from a mass balance calculation perspective, great. We've got Ed in a position where he knows, okay, now I'm going to go to my fertilizer dealer, my certified crop advisor, and I'm going to put together a fertilizer plan that gets me 120 pounds of nitrogen and gets me as close to 82 pounds of potassium as I can. And I also wanted to address magnesium, sulfur, boron, whatever other kind of deficiencies that we've identified. So we took Ed's nutrient management plan. His nutrient plan says he needs 120, 0, 80. We looked at the plant analysis. The plant analysis determined that we needed an extra 20 pounds of sulfur, an extra 20 pounds of magnesium, extra 2 pounds of boron. Next question we need to ask Ed is, what on-farm equipment does he have to make those applications happen? Ed has dry fertilizer on his corn planter, and he has liquid nitrogen tanks that he can store liquid nitrogen in for later on. So that's great. Easy question to answer. We know that we can address some of our nutrient needs through sources that can be applied through a corn planter, and we know we can address some of our nutrient needs through sources that can go through a spreader. Next question, what sources or fertilizer options does his ag retailer have that fits his needs? So you go to his local ag retailer and you ask, hey, these are my needs. I need nitrogen, I need magnesium, I need potassium. What do you have? Well, they have urea, they have ammonium sulfate, they have potash, they also have K-mag. K-mag is potassium, magnesium, and sulfur in one molecule. On a liquid perspective, they also have urea, ammonium nitrate, and they can deliver that to Ed anywhere from a 26% UAN solution all the way up to a 32% UAN solution, depending on his needs. And most of that need is going to be based on sulfur. They have ammonium thiosulfate on hand that if Ed needs sulfur, they can mix ammonium thiosulfate in with the UAN to blend it to whatever kind of concentration he wants. They can easily take liquid boron, put that right in with a liquid solution and address his boron needs there. So now we've taken the need that we had from our mass balance calculation. We've identified additional needs through our soil tests, through our plant analysis. We've identified what options Ed has to deliver those needs. And we've talked to his fertilizer retailer about what sources are available, right? So that's how we're addressing source on a farm. Little bit of a sidetrack here. When we're talking about source, right, and knowing that urea and UAN solutions are such a common nitrogen fertilizer source here in Pennsylvania and really just on the East Coast, we need to find a way to make sure that we have practices or products in place to reduce that nitrogen loss. Urea, volatilization losses can be 3% a day. Urea ammonium nitrate liquid solutions, it's half urea. So you've got a lot of exposure on that product from a surface application. And it really brings you into the conversation of nitrogen stabilizers. If we're looking at this nitrogen uptake curve, and we know we don't need a lot of nitrogen in that emergence to knee-high stage, if farmers choose to put nitrogen on during that period, we want to make sure that there are practices, a best management practice in place to reduce or greatly minimize the amount of volatilization losses that can happen. So all sources of nitrogen vulnerable to loss, whether it's above ground volatilization or below ground processes like immobilization, denitrification, and leaching. So from a nitrogen stabilization conversation, we're just going to simply break it down. Do you need above ground stabilizers or do you need below ground stabilizers? Generally, when farmers talk to their ag retailers, that's the conversation. Are you more worried about above ground or are you more worried about below ground? Some of it depends on how you're placing your fertilizer. Some of it depends on the inherent soil characteristics that you're dealing with. But when we're looking at above ground stabilizers, we're traditionally looking at a urease inhibitor. And that is just preventing that urea molecule, when that urea molecule hits the soil and it doesn't have water to link that urea to the soil, and it has a high potential to volatilize, we're going to place a urease enzyme on there that's going to temporarily block that conversion from occurring. And maybe that conversion can be blocked for 10 to 14 days, but it gives the farmer time for rain to come and incorporate that urea into the soil. From a nitrification or a below ground inhibitor, we're really looking to put a product in place around that nitrogen molecule that can block the activity of bacteria for a little while and prevent the conversion of ammonia to nitrate that can leach down through the soil profile and be lost. So we want to make sure that when we have nitrogen applied during vulnerable periods, that we have products in place to help farmers reduce that loss. Nitrogen stabilizers, when they're used appropriately, and when I say appropriately, the biggest issue we have with stabilizers is farmers choose the wrong one. They're mostly concerned about above ground, but somehow or another they buy a below ground product. But when they're used appropriately, they can really reduce that nitrogen loss by 20 to 40%, which is very respectable from a fertilizer product. So we're really looking at this vulnerable nitrogen period. If somebody is putting nitrogen on pre-emerge and they're hoping that that nitrogen is going to be available, we better have something in place to protect that nitrogen until nitrogen uptake is greatest. So nitrogen stabilizers are certainly something that we want everybody to be familiar with. We want that to be part of the 4R nitrogen management conversation. And for simplicity's sake, just like the farmers are talking to their ag retailers about above ground versus below ground, that's how we'd want you to reference it too, where If we have urea, we're more concerned about above ground. If we have some nitrate fertilizer sources, we're more concerned about below ground. So quick polling question for you. See if I can make this polling question live here. Nope, I can't. I'm going to give you the answer right away. Polling, here we go. Which fertilizer BMP is effective for addressing application timing? So this we're transitioning now. We talked about source. Ed's got all of his source decisions made. Now he's going to move on to timing. We're going to try to figure out what is the best timing for the application of those sources. So what fertilizer BMP is most effective for addressing application timing? Is it utilizing UAN with above ground stabilizers instead of urea? Is it splitting the total nitrogen need between multiple applications? Is it injecting that fertilizer below the ground where it will not be exposed to volatilization losses? Or is it really matching our sulfur and micronutrient needs based on soil tests so that we have that comprehensive relationship of nutrient uptake in our fields? And it didn't take you guys long to answer this one. Overwhelmingly, you picked the right answer, and that's B, splitting total need into multiple applications. When you think of fertilizer best management practices and what kind of BMP can we apply to the landscape to help our farmers improve nitrogen use efficiency, split applications, by far the best practice that we can have farmers implement on their fields. So for whatever reason, when I do a poll, my PowerPoint freezes up, so I'm going to jump out of here again and then jump back in. And we're going to talk about the right time. Right time for fertilizer, we're really focusing on matching that fertilizer application to the crop uptake period. And it goes back to that graph that we showed from the University of Illinois with nitrogen uptake, that we want to make sure that the majority of the fertilizer that farmers are applying are applied just before we have the biggest demand for that nutrient. So if we can delay our nitrogen applications, we can avoid that big vulnerability period. If we can delay our nitrogen applications, it also gives us the ability to use some in-season adaptive tools, which can be great for trying to quantify our soil health contributions, right? If you have a clover cover crop and you want to know exactly how much nitrogen is being contributed to your corn from that clover, by split applying or managing the timing of our nitrogen applications, it gives us more time to implement some BMPs like nitrogen modeling, like using the PSNT, doing some plant sampling to figure out what our rate of supplemental fertilizer should be. Soil characteristics definitely play a role in it. If you have a sandy soil versus a clay soil versus a shale soil, all that's going to impact how you're managing the timing of your fertilizer applications. And just like with source, there's this interaction between all the other R's, right? Between source, rate, and place, and how you're managing the timing of that application. So I would say from a source perspective, we talked about that already. If you're going to go out and broadcast urea May 1st and plant your corn on May 1st, knowing that that corn is not going to have a high demand for nitrogen until about June 10th, you've got 40 days where that nitrogen is highly susceptible to loss. And we want to make sure that if that is the only way the farmer can put nitrogen on, that he has a stabilization product on hand in that fertilizer to add protection to it. From a placement perspective, can we always place our fertilizer at the best placement at all times of the year? No, we can't. I think taking a urea or a UAN example, boy, wouldn't it be great if we can inject liquid nitrogen, 100% of our liquid nitrogen on a field, but it's probably not possible just because of uptake curves and the amount of liquid nitrogen that you would have to do and the equipment that you would need to do that. We just don't have the equipment on farms in the region to do enough fertilizer injection to cover large acreages during that rapid uptake. So it'd be like injecting nitrogen when corn is knee high. We just don't have the capacity to do that right now. So there's definitely an interaction between our timing of the application and how we're placing it. If we're going to focus on time, we might end up sacrificing place. If we're going to focus on time, it might limit the sources that are good for that particular application. So I want you to be aware of all those different interactions that can occur. So back to Ed, back to our Berks County farmer. Talk a little bit more about his specific situation. So we know from his nutrient management plan that he needed 120 pounds of nitrogen, 82 pounds of potassium. We went back into his soil tests, did some plant sampling, realized that there was a need for sulfur, magnesium, and boron. We went to his fertilizer retailer, figured out what sources that they were going to have, and now it's time to talk about the timing. And when I was putting together this presentation, I was torn as to whether or not timing or placement would be number two. A new source was going to be the first thing that we talked about. A new rate was going to be the last thing that we were going to talk about. And I was torn between how to present to you time versus place. And I ended up focusing on time. But I think just that indecisiveness on my part as to which was number two and which was number three kind of highlights the complexity of some of these management decisions that farmers are making. Ed's timing goal, right? When Ed thinks of fertilizer timing and making sure that the timing of his nitrogen applications on his corn crop is appropriate, his goal is to make sure that he has enough nitrogen stored in that plant and that there is enough available nitrogen in the soil to support kernel fill. Like I said before, we hardly ever see nitrogen deficiencies on earlier growth stages unless there's something egregiously wrong. But late season, we see it pretty commonly because we didn't do enough planning for that later growth stage, or we had unanticipated weather events that just led to a lot of loss. So that's his goal, right? Whatever we do with nitrogen management on his farm related to time, it has to be related to making sure there's enough nitrogen during that later growth phase. There's some risk in that. If we over-apply our nitrogen, or if we apply all of our nitrogen when it's knee-high, thinking that it's going to be there in kernel fill, there's weather risks, there's loss risks associated with that. Even if we're delaying our nitrogen to when corn is knee-high, there's still a lot of time that can occur before those kernel fill periods exist. Maybe when you're doing a side dress application or a split application, you need to have a nitrogen stabilizer in that to help you ensure that you have adequate nitrogen throughout the season. The other risk is nitrogen deficiency. Maybe it goes against your thinking here, but if I'm going to take 50% of Ed's nitrogen and I'm going to delay it until the corn is knee high, and the day comes when the corn is knee high, he's ready to go out and fertilize the corn, and we get 4 days of rain. Ed gets 5 inches of rain in 3 days, and it delays his ability to make that side dress application for a week. We have production risks. We have risks of Ed's corn being nitrogen deficient. We have risk of Ed's equipment not being able to get through the field anymore. So as much as split applications are probably the best BMP that we can recommend to a farmer for addressing time, we do need to be aware that there are some risks associated with that split application. So in Ed's case, he's got 3 different applications that we're going to make. We're going to time his nitrogen applications 3 different ways. We're going to use his corn planter that puts dry fertilizer on, and we're going to use a mixture of urea, ammonium sulfate, K-mag, and potash. And you're probably thinking to yourself, why are you overcomplicating this? Like, why are you putting all 4 of those into a blend? Well, part of that's due to source, and part of that's due to placement. When you have a starter fertilizer and 2x2 placement, so there's different ways that you can put your starter fertilizer on, and we'll talk about this in a later slide, but you run the risk of crop injury if you have too much fertilizer on that close to the seed. So what we end up doing here is we end up modifying Ed's planter fertilizer to avoid that crop injury and to minimize the rate that he's applying, right? So if ammonium sulfate or AMS is 21% nitrogen and urea is 46% nitrogen, I need twice as much ammonium sulfate in order to meet those nitrogen needs. That means Ed would have to increase his fertilizer application rates by 100 pounds to the acre in order to do that. Well, if I increase his application rates by 100 pounds to the acre, now he can only plant 15 acres in a fill-up instead of 20. That reduces his efficiencies. He doesn't like that. So we are pushing together all these different sources in this starter fertilizer application rate to maximize his operational efficiencies and to minimize the amount of risk that he has from injury in that fertilizer. A complex thing to think about, but that's why you see 4 products that are listed together. Second split application that Ed is going to do is he's going to do a pre-emerge fertilizer application, which is going to be a broadcast liquid fertilizer application with his herbicides. Now we're going to follow that up with a side dress application, which is a banded liquid application, and that is going to include urea ammonium nitrate. We're going to put a little bit of ammonium thiosulfate in there for sulfur, and that's a wonderful place to add some boron in for that side dress application that you can address the boron issues on the farm. So we've taken his sources. We know the sources that he has access to. We've allocated them to the times that we want those applications to be made. And we've also had some other thoughts in terms of crop safety and operational efficiency that need to come into play when we're working with farmers to put an effective fertilizer program in place. So, right place, right? We talked about source, talked about the timing of it. Now it's time to move on to place. When you think about placement of fertilizer, think of manure, right? If we surface apply, broadcast our manure, it's going to be exposed to a lot of volatilization losses. If we find a way to inject that manure, we really increase the retention rates of the manure that we applied. Same will hold true for fertilizer. But if we find ways to put that fertilizer below the soil surface, we're going to greatly reduce our risk of volatilization losses. Placement at the wrong time can obviously lead to a lot of losses. If a farmer is going to come to you and say, hey, I just bought an injection rig that I can inject liquid nitrogen on my corn, how about I go out and do that in March? The answer is no. Because even though they got the place right, the timing is completely wrong, and they're still going to be exposed to a whole lot of losses. And there again, that's some of the interaction that can occur between place and time, or place and rate, place and source. Want to revisit the rate and place interaction to talk about excessive starter fertilizer rates. You can all go into the Penn State Agronomy Guide or any land-grant university's agronomic literature, and you can find information on starter fertilizer. And there's different ways to apply it. You can apply it 2 inches off the row and 2 inches below the seed. You can apply a pop-up fertilizer right on the seed. You can apply a dribble band on the soil surface 2 inches off the seed. There's numerous ways that farmers can do a starter fertilizer application. The closer you put fertilizer to a corn seed and the higher the rate that fertilizer is, the more risk of injury that you have. And I would refer back to Ed this year. Ed had, we had gone through this calculation with Ed, and he said, great. The sources that you want to put in, the ammonium sulfate, the K-mag, the urea, the potash, we went to his fertilizer dealer. There's no problem to blend all that. Got the fertilizer back, and Ed says, how much do I put on? Well, you do the calculation, put 200 pounds on. Okay, so Ed went out to his corn planter, and he looked at the different options he had for fertilizer application rates. And his closest one was like 217 pounds. He could have done 185 pounds, or he could have done 217 pounds. Ed's like most farmers, more is better. So he put 217 pounds of this blend on, and you see the seeds down on the bottom right-hand corner where you have the one on the very left and the one on the very right, they germinated, and the 4 in the middle did not. That's what happens when you get too much fertilizer close to the seed. Kills the germination, kills the plant. So right place for fertilizer use efficiency can be the absolute wrong place for crop safety. So we have to watch that very carefully when we're talking to farmers about placement of fertilizer and the uses of starter fertilizer or fertilizer that's applied with the planter at planting. You know, his goal for placement is definitely to have enough stored in that plant to support kernel fill. He understands the risks of crop safety. He also understands the risks of nitrogen loss. You can bet that next year, Ed's nitrogen rates in his starter fertilizer are not going to be as high. So we've got that in place for him. We talk about making sure that we have the banded application at planting. We've got broadcast nitrogen for him with his pre-emerge, and we have a surface banded application in his side dress. That's how Ed is handling his fertilizer applications. I'm going to try to speed up my time. It's 11 o'clock already. Sorry about that. Right rate, right? Rate's probably the most important thing, and I'm going to breeze through it like nothing. We need to make sure that we get the right rate. At the end of the day, after we talk about source, time, and place, if we can't get the right rate for the crop, we're not going to maximize yield, and we're going to have too much loss into the environment. The right rate's going to vary year to year. It's going to vary field to field, and it's going to vary within a field. The right rate of nitrogen at one end of the field is not the right rate of nitrogen at the other end of the field because you have so much soil variability, soil texture, organic matter, mineralization, you name it. We need to have practices in place that help us capture that, and that's more of the adaptive technologies that are coming down the road to help us manage in season. We definitely need to have a source factor factored in with rate. We definitely need to have a time factored in with rate. We certainly need to have a place factored in with rate for managing our manure setbacks and managing the crop safety of the fertilizer that we're applying. So back to Ed. He did everything for source, timing, and place. Now he's ready to go for rate. So we have his at planting applications, we have his pre-emerge applications, we have his side dress applications. We're addressing some of the other issues with sulfur and magnesium in that starter fertilizer. We're addressing the boron issues in his side dress. We're split applying his nutrients so that we're minimizing our loss pathways. And we're using stabilizers whenever we do a broadcast application, again, to minimize those lost pathways. His total fertilizer application leaves us short on some things. We're short on potassium, we're short on magnesium. He can address those in his small grain silage if he wanted to. He has those options. We can go through the exact same calculation for his small grains as we did for the corn. And as a matter of fact, we do. So last polling question, true or false? There are multiple opportunities to improve fertilizer use efficiency. And I don't see that one on here. Maybe it missed it. Anyway, you were all going to answer true. Just admit it. And you're really excited about it too. So I feel your excitement. I understand how excited you can be about fertilizer use efficiency. So we're going to share with you some tools that we can do for fertilizer use efficiency, practices that you can go out and talk to your farmers about to make sure that the pound of nitrogen that they apply to their corn gets into the plant and doesn't end up in the stream down the road. Split applications. Talked about that a couple of times in the presentation. We definitely want people looking for split applications of nitrogen on their farm. When I'm working with my clients, I like to split it up between some nitrogen at planting through the planter, followed up with another split application as a side dress application. Those are two very easy things that farmers can be doing in order to better manage their nitrogen rates. Precision ag technologies coming down the road very quickly. Very quickly. You have a lot of opportunity for farmers to manage subspatially, where one part of the field can be managed differently than another part of the field because they have the technology to variable rate apply nitrogen, because they have the technology to capture the variability that's in their field. Once somebody gets a couple of years worth of satellite imagery, once somebody gets a few years worth of yield data, if they have the variable rate capabilities or their ag retailer has the variable rate capabilities, they can make that map reality where they can manage in field and put different rates of nitrogen on different parts of the field and hopefully drive production and increase nutrient use efficiency. I don't know if I can effectively convey to you the opportunity that exists here on farms to better manage nitrogen through some of our precision ag technologies. I'm very excited about it. And I think over the next few years, you'll be hearing more from our organization on how farmers can use precision ag technologies to do that. Nitrogen stabilizers. We can all be out advocating for the use of nitrogen stabilizers. Remember, above ground versus below ground, that's all we need to think about. And to talk to our farmers and say, hey, how are you applying the nitrogen to your corn? Are you thinking about a stabilizer for that situation? We want to be having those conversations. Some other tools, soil structure and drainage. You just can't stress the fundamentals enough. when people want to go into precision ag, or they want to adopt high-flying technologies, the technologies, those high-flying things only pay back if we have the fundamentals in place. Soil structure, soil drainage is a basic fundamental. If farmers aren't managing compaction, if they're not looking at runoff and erosion on their farms, it's going to be hard to really have a holistic plan in place that helps them manage their nitrogen. They've got to be able to start with that. Adaptive management, just like precision ag, adaptive management is coming down the road fast. You have nitrogen modeling programs on the market right now. Granular agronomy is one of them. AdaptN is another one. If you haven't tinkered around with either one of those, I think you would enjoy it. Checking out how they can be used to help farmers better manage their nitrogen, and more importantly, better quantify the contributions we're getting from our soil. It's these tools that we can implement on heavy cover crop situations to figure out what our nitrogen contribution can be and how we're going to manage fertilizer in some of our soil health practices. And the last thing I have up here is agronomic principles. And you're probably thinking, why do you have agronomic principles up here? And we're talking about increasing fertilizer efficiency. Because if you don't plant your corn at the correct depth, and if you don't take care of your weeds, and if you just mess up on a lot of the basic fundamental agronomic things, you're never going to increase or maximize your fertilizer use efficiency. If Ed is going to go out and put 120 pounds of nitrogen on his corn, and he plants his corn a half-inch deep, we're only going to use 60 pounds of that nitrogen because the corn plant's never going to develop to a point to use the other 60 pounds. So we've got to have these agronomic fundamentals in place, particularly surrounding how we establish our crops, how we plant them, and how we're managing pests in the field. So that's what I have for you today. I definitely want you to understand and take home that the 4R toolbox, whether we're talking about best management practices for manure or 4R best management practices for fertilizer, they're effective at reducing nitrogen loss and increasing nitrogen recovery on our field. But just like the conversation on managing our manure, we continually need to be having that fertilizer conversation with our farms so that they can adopt these practices and make a difference in our water quality issues. So I want to thank you again for joining the webinar. And again, a shout out to the Campbell Foundation for supporting our work in nutrient stewardship. And I think we're ready for questions.
All right. Well, great, everyone. And thank you all for joining. We did go over, but if you had to jump off, or if you know someone that had to jump off, we are going to be sharing the recording. So if you need to see the end, you'll have access to that. If you haven't already, please enter your name and your certification number into the chat box. We are doing that twice, so we have that again at the end to make sure that we can get credit for everyone. I saw one question come in, and it was around the precision ag technologies. Someone has discussed with a farmer about implementing this. Sorry, it's kind of keeps jumping around on me. I'm having trouble finding it. Yeah, so it's a question about the precision ag tech. A farmer had said that they didn't think it was accurate for Western PA because of how many hills they have. There's concerns with the accuracy of the maps. Do you have any thoughts on this? They would appreciate any thoughts.
A lot of thoughts on that. I think we could spend another hour talking about the uses of precision ag on farms. I share some of the concerns too with inaccuracy of maps. I don't think we can rely on soil maps that we draw into precision ag platforms to be a base layer for decision making. We've got to have layers coming in from other places. From our management strategies and how we've been handling precision ag, you can bring in remote sensing images over a period of 3 or 5 years and turn that into one normalized layer that can be fairly accurate at identifying in-field variability. If you have the ability to take those remote sensing images and combine that with a yield map or two, greatly increases our ability for accuracy purposes. Precision ag, you know, I usually talk to people about taking it slow and being pragmatic about the practices that we're doing with precision ag and really what our expectations are. It's a work in progress that the path that one farm takes is probably not right for all farms.
All right. Great. So I think that was the only question we had come in through the chat. I don't know if anyone else has any questions. If you do, you can raise your hand or go off mute. But I think with no other questions, we are over. So thank you everyone for your participation, and we hope that you will join us next week for our third training module on 4Rs and conservation. And you will be receiving a follow-up email in a day or two with the recording for this, and also with a follow-up survey that we would greatly appreciate if you could complete. And if you haven't completed the follow-up survey for the first training module and you did participate in it, we would greatly appreciate if you could answer that, even if you know, obviously we're past the deadline for that, but if it is still open, and we would greatly appreciate your results. So with that being said, thank you all. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. See you next week, everybody.